Welcome, fellow horror hounds, and welcome to episode 6 of Talk and Stalk, your unholy home for horror. I'm Barry, your host. Unfortunately, I'm not actually joined today by my corrupted co-host Samuel, who unfortunately is actually able to attend. So I'm actually doing this one solo. I'm going on my own. I've kind of lost the Stu Macker to my Billy Loomis. Not to say that I look anything like Skeet Ulrich. I wish, but yeah, our last two episodes were actually about Scream and Scream 2. Of course, you know, they're two films I love, and I thought it would be somewhat fitting to actually now do an episode on a movie that very much inspired Scream. It's a little-known horror movie, you may have heard of it, released in 1978, called Halloween. Now, anyone that knows me knows that I love Halloween, and obviously it's a film that had a huge impact, a huge influence on the horror genre. It was almost certainly the commercial success of Halloween that really kind of helped to popularise the subgenre, that being slasher. It was a film that really kind of kick-started the subgenre, if you will, and upon release, I mean, it was made on a budget of $320,000, I believe. It actually made well over $60 million at the box office, actually becoming the most successful independent film of all time upon release. Directed by John Carpenter, of course, who'd only directed two films prior to that, Dark Star in 1974 and Assault on Precinct 13 in 1976. But it's really with Halloween that really kind of helped him to cement his place in horror history. You know, where do we start on this film? Jamie Lee Curtis, cast in her first film role. Obviously this was her breakthrough role, and she very quickly went on to become a scream queen. She definitely has a sense of likability and vulnerability in this movie, but also she proves to be incredibly resilient and resourceful when needed. The legend that is Donald Pleasence, a very established actor at this point, who ironically almost turned the film down. He actually read the script, wasn't keen on it. It actually took some arm twisting from his granddaughter, who was actually a big fan of Carpenter's directorial debut, that being Dark Star, like I say, in 1974, that she convinced her grandfather to take on the role. And obviously he appeared in many of the Halloween films afterwards, and he was perfect as Dr. Sam Loomis. You know, very much a British thespian. Ironically, Christopher Lee, the legend, the horror icon Christopher Lee, obviously very famous for his 10 roles as Dracula amongst countless other movies. He actually turned the film down. He was actually, he didn't like the script, and later regretted it, and actually said that was actually the biggest mistake of his career. So we could have actually had Christopher Lee, but Donald Pleasence is perfect in the role. PJ Soles in the film as Linda, who obviously starred in Carrie just a couple of years prior. It's, you know, Halloween is a film that is very simple in its concept, but it's just perfectly executed. It's a film that's directed with a lot of finesse by John Carpenter. Like I say, it's very low budget. They had very little money to work with. But it's a film that, you know, much like Night of the Living Dead and Texas Chainsaw Massacre before it, it's a film that really proves that you really don't need much money to make an effective film or a scary movie. And there's, you know, it's a film that's certainly, like I say, very simple in concept, but it's a movie that John Carpenter really wanted to make the most of in terms of its low budget. It makes great use of Panaglide camera. John Carpenter, with this movie, actually is heavily reliant on the audience's anticipation. The antagonist in this movie, Michael Myers, could actually pop out from any angle. There's this sense of where is he going to come from next? And it does make great use of the Panaglide. You know, Carpenter had little money to work with. They just wanted to try and make the scariest film they could with the money that they had. You know, the score to this movie perfectly complements the film. The score, of course, has gone on to become one of the most iconic scores in the history of horror, which John Carpenter actually composed himself. It's simple but highly effective. Carpenter had actually made this movie without a score initially and actually showed it to some execs. And a lot of these execs actually turned around and actually said, you know, there's nothing really scary about this movie. He took the film away, composed a score, and voila, it's perfect. It's perfect to the movie that it's in. It perfectly complements each scene. And the thing is, with this movie also, a horror icon was born in Michael Myers. I'd imagine a lot of you horror fans out there probably already know that originally it was actually a William Shatner mask that was actually spray painted white. The eye holes were widened, the hair was messed up, and that's how the look of Michael Myers was actually created. It was actually the production designer, Tommy Lee Wallace, that actually chose the mask. Believe it or not, originally the mask was a clown mask. A clown mask was actually considered, which ironically Michael Myers does actually wear in the opening to the film, which we'll talk about shortly. Tommy Lee Wallace picked up the cheapest mask he could find, and that was it. And the look of Myers was created. You know, played by Nick Castle, who was actually a good friend of John Carpenter's at the time. He was paid very little money for basically just kind of walking about as Myers. He was basically just told, try and keep it as human-like as possible, and there's a really kind of creepy, albeit organic feel to the way that Myers actually moves in this movie. He's very much the boogeyman in this film. And what I really love about this movie is that Michael Myers actually spends the majority of the film actually stalking his victims. He seems to get as much pleasure from stalking as he does the kill itself. You know, there's almost a supernatural element to him. You know, 1 minute he's there, standing, stalking, the next minute he's gone, which obviously, you know, kept the audience very much on edge, because you never quite know where Myers is actually going to appear from next. I think Nick Castle actually did a great job in the role. He wasn't actually the only person to actually be under the mask, in fact. For the famous, what is now famous, closet scene in which Jamie Lee Curtis obviously barricades herself inside the closet, that was actually the production designer himself, Tommy Lee Wallace. He would actually go on to become a film director. He directed Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. He directed the 1990 TV miniseries of It. Jim Windburn was actually Myers when Myers is actually shot a few times and obviously falls off the balcony. That was actually the stunt actor Jim Windburn. In what is one of my favourite scenes of the film, of which I think this film has many great scenes, when Tommy Lee Wallace looks out the window and sees Myers across the street just standing there watching, that was actually Deborah Hill. That was actually the producer of the movie, and at the time, John Carpenter's girlfriend. It was also her hands in the opening, the hands that actually grabbed the knife and the knife stabbing, Judith Myers. That was actually, again, Deborah Hill, because she actually had tiny hands. And, that kind of gets me on to the opening to this movie. I think the opening is great. I think the opening has become pretty iconic. Obviously all done point of view, which hadn't been utilised a huge amount of times prior to this film, actually. Black Christmas came out 4 years earlier. This movie it's filmed in such a way that it all appears to be on a single take. and yet I believe there were actually 2 or 3 cuts actually made, but it's all seamlessly integrated into each other. From we see Myers stalking outside the house, obviously his sister and her boyfriend, they've clearly just had sex. And that's the thing, this movie really takes no time in getting to the murder, in what is probably the quickest sex scene in film history, or certainly one of. It's a way of Carpenter really putting his cards on the table right from the get-go, saying, here we are, they've just had sex, we're going to kill her off. And obviously he stalks through the house, all done point of view. I love the moment where he picks up the knife, and I especially love the moment where he actually picks up the mask. So we actually get it with point of view through the clown mask. Incredibly well filmed. This film has so many, and it's kind of interesting really, because originally, apparently this film wasn't even going to be set on Halloween. The original title for the film was The Babysitter Murders. Thankfully, that idea was scrapped. To me, that title sounds little more than a TV movie. And then they kind of realised that no film had actually been set on Halloween before. And not only that, but no film had actually even had Halloween in the title. So it was really the first of its kind, and they decided Deborah Hill had plenty of babysitter stories. She'd been a babysitter when she was younger. And, the character of Laurie Strode, by the way, was actually the name of an ex-girlfriend of John Carpenter's. That's where the whole name came from. So there were plenty of stories, and, having it a babysitter being stalked and tormented really kind of grounded it, because so many people had actually been babysitters, and it was really bringing terror to kind of the house next door, to suburbia, a place that is supposed to be safe, and yet it's thrown into chaos. Like I said, this film just has so many great scenes. It's a film that I certainly admire a lot from a technical standpoint. Now, I know Wes Craven, who's obviously one of the biggest names in horror. Wes Craven isn't actually a big fan of this movie. He actually admires it from a technical standpoint, but he's actually said that he's not really a big Halloween fan. We got Scream essentially because of Halloween, though, because of Kevin Williamson, the screenwriter for Scream. Halloween is his favourite movie of all time. And this movie proved to be very inspirational. There was a lot of slasher films that obviously followed in his footsteps. Very few, I feel, actually hold up to Halloween. There's a lot of good slasher films out there. There's certainly a lot during the Golden Age. Films like I've mentioned before, such as be it Terror Train, The Burning, House on Sorority Row, etc. But very few films out there within this subgenre have been as well made and as well crafted as Halloween. One scene I particularly love is the scene in which Laurie Strode has actually just dropped off the keys, and as she's walking down the street, Myers is at the forefront of the camera, actually watching her every step of the way. Unbeknownst to her, Myers is stood right behind her, watching her. She's obviously singing the song "I Wish I Had You All Along," which is obviously improv. And it's got to be said about this as well, Jamie Lee Curtis actually didn't think she was going to get the job. She actually, for the audition and her first day of filming, she actually felt as though she was going to get a telephone call telling her, look, you're not good enough, etc. And I think by her being cast in the movie was in a way a great tribute to Psycho, which of course, starred her mother, Janet Leigh, who was famously killed in the shower in Psycho, in what is probably the most iconic moment in horror movie history. Another moment that I actually love in the film that again has become quite iconic among horror fans is the famous sit-up moment near the end of the film. You know, it goes back to Michael Myers being seemingly having a supernatural aspect to him. Not only does he kind of have this almost teleportation skill, he seems to be seemingly unkillable. And obviously the moment is her at the forefront of the camera, Michael Myers' body is in the background, and after a few seconds or so, obviously Michael Myers does what is now his famous sit-up. It's a great moment, and he just tilts his head. Again, it's John Carpenter making great use of camera, what's in the forefront, what's in the background. You know, there's another moment prior to this where Laurie's just found her dead friends. She stood there at the forefront, and there's a large shadow, a large doorway in the background, and Michael Myers very slowly comes into view from the darkness. And obviously she gets stabbed, she falls down the stairs, and that's where the very much the climax of the movie really starts. The climatic chase scene, which again is complemented wonderfully by its score. I just love how Myers stands there at the top of the stairs, and he walks down the stairs, and he smashes through the door, he walks after her, and obviously the next moment he gets stabbed in the neck with the knitting needle. You know, and it's just one of the greatest chase scenes in slasher movie history. And yeah, this is the thing as well with this movie. It kind of makes you wonder whether Michael Myers is actually a normal human being, or if he is evil, as Dr. Sam Loomis, Donald Pleasance's character, says in this movie. There's actually a fantastic monologue, you know, that I met him 15 years ago, and he explains that what was living behind this boy's eyes was purely and simply evil. You know, he mentions about him having the devil's eyes. It's interesting actually as well, because when Myers is actually unmasked, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that were really kind of anticipating and kind of excited to see what Myers would look like underneath the mask, a different actor was actually used. It was actually Tony Moran that was actually used as Myers. So there was Nick Castle, obviously Jim Winburn, Deborah Hill. There were quite a few people behind Myers. And of course, the ending to this movie, Myers is shot quite a few times. His body's left there on the floor. Dr. Sam Loomis actually goes to check on him, and of course, he's gone. It was a great ending, I thought. It was a really kind of ambiguous kind of ending. We know Myers is still out there, but you know what's going to happen next. And I love the line where Laurie Strode actually says to Dr. Sam Loomis, was he the boogeyman? He says, as a matter of fact, it was. There's another line I love in this film, courtesy of Charles Cyphers, that obviously plays Annie Brackett's father. And that is, it's Halloween, I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare. I just love that line. And obviously that line was also repeated in Halloween H2O, which actually made some good kind of nods and homages to Halloween, to the original movie. This time it was courtesy, of course, Janet Leigh, who, you know, Psycho. And yeah, I love, not to get off the subject too long, but I love the interactions between Laurie, Jamie Lee Curtis, and her mother in that movie. And there's a great nod to Psycho in Halloween H2O, of course. You know, she's actually getting in the car that she drove in 1960s Psycho, and you can actually hear part of the Psycho soundtrack for a few seconds. It's a great little moment. And yeah, another scene where Laurie Strode's sitting there in the school, and she looks out and Myers is stood there beside the car, and of course she looks back after a few minutes and he's gone. Yeah, it's the kills themselves in this movie, like I say, you know, Halloween's a very slow burning film. I mean, there's very little in the way of blood there. It's a very low body count. Its emphasis really is on suspense and atmosphere, and I think that's what really sets it apart from most other slasher films. Especially going into the early 80s, you know, there were a lot of slasher films there, kind of reliant on gore effects. Admittedly, great gore effects, you know, courtesy of people like Tom Savini, etc. Friday the 13th being a great example, which obviously came out just a year and a half after Halloween, and that proved to be a successful film as well. You know, that was the movie that was actually the first slasher film to ever be backed by a major studio, that being Paramount. Halloween proved that these films can actually make good money at the box office. Another particular scene that I think is regarded as probably being one of the best Myers scenes in the film is when Myers has actually stood there by the hedge. And as Annie and Laurie are walking down the street, Laurie sees him, Annie doesn't, and he steps behind the bush. And there's that great moment of kind of Annie walking towards the bush. And again, it's John Carpenter relying on our anticipation for something to happen. And she gets there, and of course, Myers is gone. It's interesting, there's a little goof in that scene actually as well. I'm not sure if a lot of people picked up on it, but you can actually see some smoke. As she gets to the hedge, you can actually see some smoke blow right in front of Annie. That was actually John Carpenter smoking a cigarette. He was actually stood pretty close to the character, and that was a goof. There's another goof in the opening. You know, it's a great moment when Myers escapes and that. When Myers actually smashes the window with, what's believed to be his bare hand. But you can actually see a wrench. I believe it's a wrench or a spanner that's actually taped to his hand to actually cause the break. You can really notice it, certainly, when you watch it on Blu-ray. But, these are just every film has goofs and so forth. It's also interesting as well that the movie, I'm not sure if this was actually intentional foreshadowing or not, but the movie that Lindsay and Tommy actually watch on Halloween is The Thing from Another World, which of course is the movie that John Carpenter 4 years later would actually remake. The Thing, which, if classified as a remake, which technically it is, it's a very loose remake. I mean, it's, in a way I feel like it's kind of unfair to compare the original movie with the 82 film. They are quite different. The 82 film boasts great practical effects, as you know, and in the original it's very much just a man in a costume, but it's a classic sci-fi horror film. But yeah, it's the movie that they're actually watching, which I don't know if that's a little nod to saying that Carpenter was gonna later remake this film. Carpenter actually does have an uncredited cameo in the film as well, if you will. When Paul, Annie's boyfriend, actually phones her, it's actually John Carpenter's voice on the telephone. In this whole scene as well, I think there's a great little moment of Annie actually, walking past the window, and we quickly see Myers. And then as she walks back again, he's gone. Like I say, Myers actually spends the majority of this film actually watching and stalking his victims. And, to me, that's what sets Myers apart from Jason. Now, admittedly, in later films, in later sequels, Myers does become more of a Jason Voorhees. The films have higher body counts and they become more gory, etc. But in the original movie, to me, that's the perfect depiction of Michael Myers. Now, I think Dick Warlock did a good job in Halloween 2. He was a little bit too robotic for my liking at times, though, but still, I thought it was a good performance. I even thought Chris Durand actually did a good job in Halloween H2O. I know he receives a lot of criticism, etc. J. Jude Courtney, the latest Michael Myers, I actually thought did a great job, and was arguably the best Michael Myers since the original Nick Castle. With the death scenes in this movie, Annie's death, the opening. I mean, the opening to this movie, Judith Myers' death just really sets the tone for this film. And I think it's just one of the greatest openings in the history of slasher movies, if not horror movies. It's simple, it gets straight to the point. And like I say, it's John Carpenter saying, look, we're setting everything up with this one scene. And there's a nice kind of little nod to it, actually, in 81's The Funhouse, directed by Tobe Hooper, in which A Girl's in a Shower, which is actually making a nod to Psycho. And of course, you know, she's, well, we're believed to be she's going to be stabbed to death, but it's all done via the eye holes in the mask, which again is kind of a great tribute, a great little nod to Halloween. Annie's death in this movie, the killer in the back seat, has become a huge staple of slasher films now. We can almost guarantee whenever a character gets in the car, the killer's probably going to be in the back seat. Now, I don't know if Halloween is the first film to do this. I'd imagine it isn't, but it's the first slasher movie that I can think of that actually did this. It's a great little moment, actually, because she gets in the car and then she realises to herself, hang on a sec, the car door wasn't locked. And of course, yep, she gets strangled, then the throat slit, but there's nothing gratuitous in this movie. You see a quick cut, and that's it. With Bob's death, which is certainly one of the highlights death-wise in the movie. Obviously, again, it comes down to a supernatural aspect. Michael Myers seems to have this superhuman strength almost. He picks him up and pins him to the door with a very large kitchen knife. It's a great death. Followed by Linda's death, who of course is strangled by the telephone wire. And amusingly, I mean, I say amusingly, I'm not laughing at her death, but in the way it's filmed, it's Laurie Strode believes that Linda is actually faking it, you know, making some fake sex noises, if you will. But yeah. And then, I think Halloween is just, you know, not to rant on too much, but yeah, Halloween it's a film that, like I said, it really kind of set the template for a lot of these films to follow. It was certainly a movie that, because, you know, it was set in this small town, Haddonfield, which is kind of bringing horror to suburbia, like I said, a place of safety. Ironically, it's set in Haddonfield, Illinois, but it was actually filmed in California. And if you can actually notice in the background, in certain scenes, that there are actually palm trees. Now, there aren't actually any palm trees in Illinois. And even though it's actually set in October, obviously Halloween time, it was actually filmed in the spring. But to give it the look and feel of autumn, leaves were actually painted. They were actually painted like brown, and they were actually blown down the street with fans to kind of create the illusion that, yeah, it is actually Halloween time here. It was, the whole movie was filmed. I mean, it's quite an achievement. The movie was filmed, I believe, in 28 days. In less than a month, the whole movie was filmed. And it went on, like I say, to become a part of horror history. You know, if it wasn't for Halloween, we probably wouldn't have Friday the 13th. We probably wouldn't have Terror Train. Obviously, Black Christmas predates it by 4 years. You could say Black Christmas is a proto-slasher film, that the slasher genre hadn't really been fully formed by that point, but it certainly had a huge helping hand. And I do believe, in fact, that Halloween actually started with its inception, was actually going to be a sequel to Black Christmas. I remember reading that Bob Clark, the director of Black Christmas, had actually talked to Carpenter about the killer, because obviously with the end of Black Christmas, the killer gets away. We don't actually know who the killer is. I love that kind of ambiguous ending to it. And, you know, what if the killer was still on the loose, etc. And what they did for Christmas, I think Bob Clark kind of had the idea of doing a Halloween-themed horror film, but a sequel, where he, you know, the killer from Black Christmas is on the loose still, and this time he's actually killing people on Halloween. And apparently there was a talk between Bob Clark and John Carpenter, and it ended up becoming Halloween. It ended up becoming a different film entirely. Not a sequel to Black Christmas, but another horror film set on a holiday, which had never actually been done before on Halloween, like I said. And Halloween quickly became a piece of horror history. We get a great scream queen in Jamie Lee Curtis. We get a British legend in Donald Pleasance. We get a great film director, which, some would say that Halloween is still arguably his best film. I would say Halloween and The Thing are my two personal favourite John Carpenter films. We got a horror icon in Michael Myers. You could say kind of inspiring Jason Voorhees. Michael Myers is actually my favourite horror movie villain. And my favourite portrayal of him is actually in the original movie. But yeah. I think that pretty much wraps everything up today. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back for another episode soon enough. Like I said, I do apologise to the audience for doing this solo, not having Samuel here. Just unfortunately, life sometimes gets in the way. He wasn't able to make it, but we'll be back again soon to haunt you, torment you, and do whatever else we want with you. So yeah, thanks for listening, and take care.